Our next problem is definitely a problem for prototype theory, but it's probably also a problem for exemplar theory. So prototype theories, recall, say that individual features are independent and additive. And so it predicts that linearly separable concepts are easier to learn than nonlinear separable concepts. So concepts where having a property or a feature makes you a member and not having that feature makes you not a member. Those are supposed to be easier to learn because these features are independent and they're additive. But despite that prediction and a considerable amount of effort, no real evidence has emerged that this is actually true of human beings. So let's consider a sort of hypothetical case of Bill Clinton thinking about his ideal woman. Right? Bill Clinton may have a linearly separable concept where hair color doesn't matter. What matters is the color of your eyes. So if you've got brown eyes, then you're his ideal woman. If you've got blue eyes, no way. And I realize it's a kind of superficial example, but it's illustrative. According to prototype theory, this should be an easy to learn concept because a single feature differentiates membership or not membership. A difficult concept to learn is a nonlinear concept, a concept where we have instances that can't be identified by possession or absence of a single property. So in this view, the ideal woman is a blue-eyed blonde or a brown-eyed brunette. All right? So possession of two features in combination determines membership in the category, where you can't simply draw a line anywhere in the space that captures all the yeses and excludes all the nos. So prototype theory predicts that these should be harder to learn. But it turns out that they're just as easy to learn as linear concepts for people. And so this prediction just doesn't pan out. Now notice that exemplar theory, as with our dog case, could explain this by supposing that there are multiple exemplars. But again, you run into this question of when are you positing an exemplar to cover empirical data in an ad hoc fashion, and when is it genuinely appropriate and explanatory? Now, there are general problems for the similarity or probability view overall. And the first one is the influence of context. So context influences typicality judgments and categorizations, period, even though concepts are supposed to be context independent in prototype and exemplar theories. So an example that Menden gives in the paper, he says that tea is considered to be more typical as a lunchtime drink when you're talking about secretaries in this experiment that they performed. So he says more people identify tea as a typical drink for secretaries at lunchtime, and milk is a less typical drink. And he says that gets switched when you talk about truck drivers, which neither of them seem typical to me, but milk is judged as more typical than tea in the context of thinking about truck drivers' lunches. So the context influences what's more typical in a way that neither the prototype theory nor the exemplar theory can really take into account. And this turns out to be very important. How do we decide? How do we disambiguate this ambiguous object like that watermelon? Turns out that the context that we're in will influence the ways in which we categorize those objects. So in some contexts, we may look at that watermelon as a green thing. Say if we're on a treasure hunt and we're looking for something green. Other cases, say if we're hungry, we may identify it as food, period. In other cases, we may identify it as fruit, say if we're in the produce section of a grocery store. All right? So context seems to influence categorization and typicality judgments, but there is no mechanism in prototype theory or exemplar theories that would help us to understand why that is. Now, again, we could posit additional exemplars that may explain that in one case or another, so context-specific exemplars. But the problem looks very pronounced in this case, that it looks like when we do that, we're going to end up positing a bunch of ad hoc explanations for context effects by positing additional exemplars with no other motivation than to accommodate our data. Finally, categorization oftentimes seems to be driven by extra featural factors, that is, other things besides mere features. And a nice example of this is modification experiments. Modification experiments showed that people tend to categorize artifacts by function rather than by feature. So they would take, say, something like a teapot, and they would modify the teapot, slowly changing features of it until it had none of the features that are common to teapots, but that it occurred in a sort of ship of Theseus fashion. One feature, then another, each time making a judgment in between, so that it was still recognized that this could perform that function or was designed or intended or originally built to serve that function. And people would still continue to identify it as an instance of an artifact, even when it was completely atypical from a feature perspective. And again, there's nothing in prototype theory or exemplar theory to explain this, in part because they're all theories about categorization that are driven by perception of features. In the second lecture, we'll look at another theory, the sort of theory of concepts, to see if it fares better or worse, or how it differs from the similarity probability views.